Hi, this is Philip Jauregui, and this is Supreme Thoughts, a publication or a platform of Judicial Action Group Foundation and also JAG. Joining me today is Bert Demicell. He's the chairman of the JAG Foundation board. And we want to talk for just a minute about some current events related to a potential Supreme Court vacancy, or maybe not. But Bert, did you see the news last week where President Trump talked about Ted Cruz as a possible Supreme Court nominee?
Yeah, I did see that. It was interesting and a little bit surprising that he would mention that. I'm curious what your take on that was.
Yeah, it sometimes you can tell, or at least you kind of get a sense from when President Trump is talking that he'll just mention some things, or he's just talking almost stream of consciousness. Here's what he's thinking, and it's coming out. This one seemed planned to me. And I want to get your take. And, of course, he said Ted Cruz for the Supreme Court, he would get 100 votes. The Democrats would want to get rid of him. And so would the Republicans, is what President Trump said. Nice laugh line there. But it seemed intentional. And so I'm curious, Bert, what was your take on that? Why would President Trump bring this up?
Well, I think sometimes, I think at times he just throws some things out there as fluff and not much meaning to it. But on the other hand, he's pretty strategic in his thinking on what he's doing on things. So, could it be that he's trying to position Ted Cruz, in a way for that rather than seeking the presidency in the 28 election? I'm not
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, but it's interesting.
It took me a while, but after a bit, thought, I don't know what President Trump was thinking, but that was my best guess that that's what he was up to. Because Ted Cruz afterwards said, "I'm not interested." I think he said pretty adamantly, "No way." And yet, also, I think President Trump probably wouldn't have Ted Cruz as his top pick. No disrespect to Senator Ted Cruz, but if that's the case, why even bring it up? And I think there had to be some other reason, like you're talking about. Which then begs the question, would President Trump also consider the same thing for somebody like Governor Ron DeSantis, who also, I'm sure, is considering running for president, and to do that to kind of clear the field for JD Vance or Marco Rubio or a Vance Rubio ticket, you know? So, but I was glad that it happened in this sense, Bert, that it brought the Supreme Court into the news and it brought a vacancy into the news,
Yes.
or at least the potential, which brings up another thought. I mean, with the elections coming up in the fall, I think this is a topic that gets the base paying attention and the base motivated. And so I think there's a potential political aspect to it also, for president to say, "Hey guys, remember the Supreme Court? There could be a vacancy. Go vote for the Senate," that type thing. So there are a lot of potential benefits from it. But then, some people say, well, there's not going to be a vacancy. There's just not. Alito and Thomas are not, they're not leaving. And so my response would be, well, how do you know that?
Hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
And I don't know that anyone has said, well, I talked to Sam Alito or Clarence Thomas, or maybe they have, and those guys have, just kind of brushed it off. And so there's this conclusion that they won't leave the bench. But I think it's really helpful to take us back 8 years ago. The same point in this same point in Trump's first presidential term was in February of 2018. Justice Anthony Kennedy retired. Didn't announce it but right when the term ended at the end of June, after the big cases came out, Kennedy said he was retiring. But we found out afterwards, Bert, and this has been very little talked about, but I don't know if you caught this. There was a book that came out that talked about the fact that Justice Anthony Kennedy, while he was on the bench, was talking to the White House about retiring. And I forget who reached out first, but discussions were being had in the fall of 2017, like October and November. Did you recall that? Or maybe you've heard me talk about it, but
I've heard you talk about it. I wasn't aware of it at that
yeah.
time, but yeah, that was interesting. And we don't know if there's going to be a seat coming up. And even just a couple of years ago, there was a lot of pressure on Justice Sotomayor to maybe resign or retire because of her health issues and things like that.
That's
So
right.
it's interesting that, maybe there's something brewing
Yeah,
down.
and Justice Kennedy and the White House kept it quiet, which now that we know what happened, you would say, well, of course they did. That makes sense that they would. And so the silence that we're getting now isn't necessarily conclusive that there won't be a vacancy, because it would be the same silence if there were going to be a vacancy and Justice Alito or Justice Thomas or someone else for that matter was planning to do it. So, but I think what's important is sooner or later we will have a
Right.
vacancy, whether it's June whether it's in the fall or whether it's next year at this time. We'll probably have one or two in the next 3 years, would be, I think, a pretty good guess on that.
Yeah.
So we need to be ready. And this is one of the big things that JAG does. Of course, there's JAG Foundation, which does a lot of research on prospects, but JAG Foundation also is looking, or pardon me, JAG also is looking and lobbying. JAG Foundation doesn't lobby, JAG does. But this is something we've been looking at for 3 years, Bert, because when a vacancy comes, you can't then decide, oh, let's go figure out what's going on here. And let's look at all the prospects and the potential justices. We've been doing this for 3 years, and we've looked at over 35 prospects.
Mm, mm.
And in some cases, generated 60 pages of research on these folks with footnotes and everything that's needed. And some people may say, well, why in the world are you doing that? I mean, there are other things happening in the world. And that's true. But Bert, we really feel like this is our calling, and there are lots of great friends and allies that we have that are covering a lot of issues, which we're very thankful for. But we feel like this is our job. This is our silo. And let's go really deep and let's be prepared so that when this type of thing happens, we're not scrambling, trying to figure out who's this person, who's that person. Are they good? Are they bad? Who did they have lunch with? What's their record? We have this research already. And Bert, in a minute, we're going to get into a couple of the shortlisters that we've looked at that we think we've put them on what we call a green list, meaning go. These are people that would be great for the Supreme Court. But on this topic, is there anything else you want to share?
Well, I would just ask you what we have the midterms coming up, and who knows what's going to happen with the midterms. So, Trump already has 3 justices on the court. So potentially there's a fourth and maybe even a fifth before the end of his current term. And, you wonder about if there's a change in the Senate leadership in the Senate, how does that impact nominations after the midterms?
Yeah. I mean, I think most people would say or have said that Republicans will likely gain seats in the Senate.
Okay.
Is that going to be the calculation in 2 months, in June, in the fall, a week before? Nobody knows. We do know that right now there are 53 Republican seats. Now, not all of those are great constitutional conservatives, as we know, but there are 53 seats.
Yeah.
If that drops a little bit, or maybe it stays the same, maybe it goes up, we just don't know. And that's one of the reasons too, Bert, that I think somebody like Sam Alito, and by the way, I am not lobbying for Sam Alito to leave the court. I want him to leave when the Lord wants him to leave. And I mean that. That guy is incredible. Placing him will not be easy because it'd be very, very hard to get better than Sam Alito, and it would be very easy to get worse than Sam Alito. So we're not lobbying for that.
Right.
But what if he's thinking, I don't know what'll happen in the fall, but I do know we have a Republican Senate now, and someone could get through now. And granted, there are a couple liberal Republicans, but you can lose 3 votes, drop down to 50, and then J.D. Vance can break the tie.
Yep.
That type of thing happens with folks. And Sam Alito, too, we've been in oral arguments, and I love Justice Alito because, man, you can almost tell what he's thinking sometimes when he's on the bench. He'll ask questions and he'll look at his fellow justices. And if I could read his mind, I think he's saying, can you believe this? What's going on here? It's like he's so done with the DC scene and the crud up there. He's a patriot for staying because I think he's tired of it. I think he's fed up with that. And he'd probably love to leave, but he loves the country and the court so much. I don't think he wants to leave it and risk someone taking his place that's going to be squishy.
Right. I agree.
Yeah. Well, why don't we do this, Bert? Let's break and then we'll come back and we'll talk about one of these green listers.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Jen. Hi, this is Philip Jauregui with Supreme Thoughts, a platform of Judicial Action Group Foundation and JAG. And with me is Bert Demicell. He's our chairman. And we want to talk with you about one of the green listers that we've looked at for Supreme Court. We've researched over 35 and looked at their judicial philosophies, their worldview, their positions on the life issue, marriage, religious freedom, Second Amendment, on down the line, and found the ones that we think are the most faithful to the Constitution and put them on a green list. And so we want to share those with you. Somebody that we'll talk about today is the Honorable James Ho. He's a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. He was nominated by President Trump during President Trump's first term in office, and he's been on the bench there in Texas on the Fifth Circuit for quite a while. And so, Bert, maybe you'd want to share a little bit about his background.
Yeah, I was looking at that, and basically he went to Stanford in undergrad, then went to law school at the University of Chicago. He clerked for Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court as part of that, but also he's worked in the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee while in Washington, D.C. before clerking for Clarence Thomas, and has quite an experience there, but then also was Solicitor General in Texas from 2008 to 2010, and then was in private practice for about 8 years before being appointed to the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals on the Fifth Circuit.
And by the way, guys, too, you can pick up this summary. This is a 10-page summary, and there's even more that we have on Judge Ho, but we've summarized it. And you can find this on the Judicial Action Group website, judicialactiongroup.com. And you're welcome to go there and download these, and you can find all this information. We don't have time to cover everything today, or you'd probably get bored, and we would too. But we'll hit some highlights just for fun for this video. One of the first things we always look at is the judicial philosophy of the prospect, because if we're looking at them as a judge, we want to look at their judicial philosophy. And so we always like originalists, people that don't want to legislate from the bench, who stick with the original meaning of the Constitution and the laws that they're looking at. And so Judge Ho is an originalist, but I love what he said, because it's one thing to kind of make the statement and know that that's what you're supposed to say. But he asserted that originalism should not be controversial, and that jurists, quote, must not be afraid of being booed as a result of issuing rulings that are unpopular. And he went on and said that unpopular with, quote, cultural elites and those who consider the Constitution to be, quote, trash. I love Judge Ho and how he talks plainly about that. And again, talking about not being booed, that's really important, because it goes to the issue of courage. And we've seen that throughout Judge Ho's record, not just in this quote, but he has courage, and he's willing to take heat. He's willing to stand out and take positions that maybe would be unpopular. That's what we need on the Supreme Court, because somebody could go give a speech and cite all 10 points that we're looking for or that others are looking for. But what does that cost them? So we look for evidence of courage when we're looking at these prospects. That's really important. And we've learned that over time. I've had the honor of getting to look at judicial nominations for 21 years now. And sometimes I've gotten it right, and sometimes I've gotten it wrong. And when we get it wrong, we want to try to learn from that and build into our search and our criteria. What are the things that really help us find the people who would be the most honorable toward the Constitution? So that's a great point. He also said that being an originalist is just part of the job description, because being an originalist just means being faithful to whatever text you're interpreting. Pretty simple stuff. And on the question of faith in the public square, another quote, he said, the First Amendment expressly guarantees the free exercise of religion, including the right, and this was in a particular matter, he said, including the right of bishops to express their profound objection to the moral tragedy of abortion. I love that he called it a moral tragedy, plain speaking. He said, by offering free burial services for fetal remains. Of course, that was dealing with abortion, which I love that. And so on the topic of religious liberty, a little bit further, during his time of serving on the Fifth Circuit, in one of his dissents, he talked about the fact that the founders understood that the right to free exercise would require more than simple neutrality toward religion. When government regulation and religious activity conflict, the right to free exercise would require that the government accommodate the religious practice rather than the reverse. And we've seen far too much of that, especially during the COVID period, where abortion clinics, strip bars were left open while churches were closed down. By the way, the Constitution doesn't talk about strip bars. You know what it does talk about? Free exercise of religion. So if anybody during COVID should have had protection to remain open, it was churches. So big point there. And Judge Ho's been great on that. Bert, on the topic of sanctity of life, is there anything there that you want to share?
You know, he's worked on a number of cases there from the Fifth Circuit, but additionally, he's adopted the most pro-life position on the Fifth Circuit panel, and concurred and dissented in part to argue that the FDA's initial approval of mifepristone, if you say that right, should be vacated altogether. You know, that's the abortion pill that you order in the mail and can take it. And that is so much in our headlines this day, and how it is so negatively being used in our society to take life. And but the fact that he's the most pro-life position on the Fifth Circuit of Appeals is a great thing.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. And As we looked at this too, sometimes it's a matter of distinguishing between good, better, and best. And Judge Ho is definitely one of the best. There's another prospect that's been talked about for the Supreme Court, and that is Andy Oldham or Andrew Oldham, who's a judge on the Fifth Circuit. And there are a lot of good things in Oldham's record. And sometimes hear people make the argument, well, so and so is good and so is good, as though that's the standard. And that may be one thing for a judge on the district court or even the circuit court. But when we're talking about the Supreme Court, there's almost certainly going to be one seat at a time, not two. Now, 20 years ago, we did have two seats that opened up at the same time, and that's when Chief Justice Rehnquist died right after Sandra Day O'Connor announced her retirement. You had two seats. But for the most part, we're going to have one vacancy at a time. And so we're not looking for, let's find somebody who's in the top 20. No, let's try to find the absolute best of the best and then find the best of those for this seat. And so I just say that because we don't want to disrespect anyone, especially like Judge Oldham. I think Judge Oldham has a good record, but it's not as good as Judge Ho's. And so when we're looking for, and this case is a great example, this mifepristone case, which I won't go into all the detail on that. I can, but Judge Oldham's vote in that case was not nearly as good as Judge Ho's. Judge Ho was the one taking the most pro-life position. I think that's demonstrably true. It's provable. And so when we're finding that one that we think is going to be the best, this is why we're doing this research, trying to find out who would be the best, because we don't want to be here 2, 5, 10 years from now saying, we've missed it, guys, over the last 50 years. Republican presidents have missed it about 50% of the time. Aren't you sick of it? I mean, how are we going to get this right? Well, the way we get it right is doing the research like we're doing. I don't mean to get too passionate about, I am passionate about it. I'm not angry, but we need to do the work and not just say, well, I heard somebody say that so-and-so would be a home run on the court. That's happened before. We actually had a comment like that about Souter. I think it was Sununu up in New Hampshire that said that Souter would be a home run. Well, guess what? Souter was not a home run. Souter was a strikeout, an unforced error. And this is why we do the research, so that we can get the absolute best of the best. I'm not saying, by the way, that Oldham would be a strikeout, but I do know Ho would be a home run. But we're basing that on our research. But then also on looking at Judge Ho's record on LGBT issues, he wrote that the relationship between a man and woman is uniquely deserving of special societal support and protection. He also said, and I think this is significant, this was in 2019. I'll come back to that in a second. In one of his writings at the Fifth Circuit, he said that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibits sex discrimination, not sexual orientation and transgender discrimination. That was before the 2020 opinion by the U.S. Supreme Court that did the opposite, that did create special protection for sexual orientation and transgender discrimination. And you know who wrote that opinion? A Republican nominee to the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch. I love Neil Gorsuch overall, and he votes the right way nearly all the time. But he didn't in that case. And it was tragic. That was not a small matter. It's one of the worst. For me, it's the worst decision we've had since Obergefell. And it was written by Justice Neil Gorsuch. And so this is, again, why we're looking for people like Judge Ho who get it right and comparing them to others. This is an example of how we can find the best of the best. And I think Judge Ho is in that category. In terms of worldview, we like to find this as well because it can be one of the best predictors of how somebody's going to do on the bench. Not what they just say about their judicial philosophy, but what is their worldview? It's one of the best indicators. And we could debate this all day long and look at the justices on the court, but it is one of the best indicators. It's why the 3 Democrat nominees who have a completely different worldview just happen to end up on the opposite side of these big worldview impacting cases. But Judge Ho is a devoted Christian, which is important. First Chief Justice John Jay said it was important. And he said that the legal institution of marriage is about biology, not bigotry. Of course, the left tries to mischaracterize it as that, but he was saying, no, this legal institution of marriage, it's about basic biology. Now, it's about more than that as a covenant, but a great statement. And then also, he said that Christians should expect to be criticized. And then he read from 1 Peter chapter 4, which states, among other things, that we should rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed. Of course, that's from the Bible, the book of First Peter. And then on the topic of the Second Amendment, Judge Ho wrote that the right to keep and bear arms is the ultimate guarantor of all other liberties enjoyed by Americans. On another topic, educational opportunity, Bert, I think there was something there that you wanted to cover.
I thought that was interesting in the case of Fisher versus the University of Texas on discrimination, where he makes a statement in this case here. He says, no matter how well intentioned the policy may be, injury is a mathematical certainty because educational admissions is a zero sum game. And then here's what he says. When a school offers admission based on a student's race, it denies admission based on a student's race. For every person you help due to race, you necessarily hurt another person due to race. And only by speaking plainly do we ensure fidelity to the Constitution. And I just thought that point just really stood out in that case. Actually, the case was Smith First School Board of Concordia that came up in the Fifth Circuit when he made that part of his opinion. So I thought that was interesting because it is a point that most of us don't think about.
That's a great point, Bert. And then there's another case from 2021 in which Judge Ho wrote, prohibiting racial discrimination means we must be blind to race. Disparate impact theory requires the opposite. Bert, there was I think a matter dealing with administrative state perhaps you wanted to share about.
Right. Yeah. He highlights the danger of granting power to those in unelected positions, such as bureaucrats and administrators and so forth. And in his dissent, he reads of this particular case, the right to vote means nothing if we abandon our constitutional commitments and allow the real work of lawmaking to be exercised by private interest colluding with agency bureaucrats rather than elected officials accountable to the American voter, and how important that is. And if you think about the growth of government within our nation over the last number of decades and the bureaucratic authority that has been given them, whether it's right in giving it to them or not, it has such an influence that this administrative state really is an issue within our country today.
And one of the areas that we look at too is what's the history of this prospect's commitment to causes. Sometimes you'll find attorneys working in cases and maybe their client wants them to take a certain position. And so what they do as an attorney is important, but sometimes you can tell a lot more when what they're doing is based on their own view. And so we look at history of commitment to causes also. And Bert, I think there was an item in there you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, just that he had dedicated, as a volunteer attorney for the First Liberty Institute, donated thousands of pro bono hours on work in this area, which is, and being a member.
And one of the other items that we look at is history of commitment to causes.
You know, and Judge Ho has been a member of the Federal Society for 26 years and held 10 different leadership positions with that organization. But something even more powerful to me or profound is that he's given thousands of hours of pro bono legal work to the First Liberty Institute. So here's a man who walks the walk and doesn't just talk the talk as well.
And we know the people at First Liberty, and that's a top-notch, excellent Christian defense firm or public interest law firm defending First Liberty, meaning our religious freedom. That's the first of the liberties, and that's what they focus on. And so that's great. And, you know, if that were the only thing in Judge Ho's record, you would say, well, that's good, but let's not focus only on that. But when you stack up his record as a judge, his statements, and then you talk about something like having worked for First Liberty, that's massive, because you might go give a speech at First Liberty and not really believe in their mission. But when you donate thousands of hours, you better believe you're all in with that. If someone were donating thousands of hours for Planned Parenthood, that would mean something. And when somebody donates thousands of hours to a great group like First Liberty, that means something as well. Yeah, great point, Bert, pointing that out. And then also in terms of governmental overreach, this is important. And for social conservatives, maybe we didn't look at a topic like this as much pre-COVID. But having gone through COVID and seeing what happened, I think we all have really dialed in on this topic, governmental overreach, abuse of power. And in a dissent in a case there in the Fifth Circuit, Judge Ho wrote regarding vaccine mandates. He said, vaccine mandates like the one in this United case is attempting to impose let me back up. He said, make no mistake, vaccine mandates like the one United Airlines is attempting to impose here presents a crisis of conscience for many people of faith. Of course, United Airlines was requiring people to get the vaccine. Judge Ho was pointing out, that creates a real problem for people of faith. And he continued, it's difficult to imagine how a crisis of conscience, whether instigated by government or industry, could be remedied by an award of monetary damages. In other words, you can't just say, well, just pay the folks some money and make them get the vaccine. Judge Ho was pointing out, you can't just remedy that with cash. We're talking about a matter of conscience and religious faith. Great point. And we needed more guys like Judge Ho during the COVID crisis, especially there at the beginning with all the governmental oppression that was going on. It was horrible. One of the worst chapters in the history of our country. And we haven't forgotten, right? Especially when it comes to finding judges of courage that we want to see on the Supreme Court. And then on the topic of immigration, Bert, I think there was something you had.
It's
Bert, I think you had a point.
Yeah, in 2024, Judge Ho gave an interview with Josh Blackman, and he was talking about birthright citizenship. And he was distinguishing between invaders and others. Okay. And he goes on to say in here that birthright citizenship obviously doesn't apply in case of war or invasion. No one, to my knowledge, has ever argued that the children of invading aliens are entitled to birthright citizenship. And I can't imagine what the legal argument for that would be. And I thought that was an interesting point to bring up because most people don't think of separating between invasion and other people that come here legally. And we have had an invasion on our southern border for 4 years during the Biden administration. So it's interesting to think about it in that perspective.
Yep. Another one, this is the final one I'll mention, and we'll wrap up here. But one other point on Judge Ho, this was in August of 2023. And he cast the sole vote to reconsider a ruling allowing Texas to continue granting illegal immigrants the right to pay lower tuition at public universities than out-of-state students. So in essence, you had illegal aliens in Texas getting better treatment than out-of-state students, and Judge Ho was opposed to that, and he was the only one asking or voting to reconsider the case based on that criteria. And he wrote, a sovereign isn't a sovereign if it can't control its borders. Congress has enacted a number of restrictions to govern entry into our country. Our national objectives are undercut when states encourage illegal entry into the United States. That's precisely what's at issue here. Congress enacted a section to forbid states from treating U.S. citizens less favorably than illegal aliens when it comes to post-secondary education benefits. Yet, that's exactly what Texas law does. And of course, Judge Ho was opposed to that. And so he's a great judge. He has a great record. Don't take my word for it. And if someone else tells you that someone is a great judge and would be a great Supreme Court justice, ask them for a briefing on it. It's fine to have opinions. I have opinions. Bert has opinions. But we're really doing the due diligence and digging and finding the evidence to support it, and finding times too when evidence doesn't support someone. Maybe somebody has a good record, but there are some major concerns. So that's what we do. And that's why we would say, that's why we know Judge Ho ought to be on the short list. He ought to be on the green list for the Supreme Court. So thank you for taking a few minutes. And again, you can go to judicialactiongroup.com. You can download all of our green list summaries, not just on Judge Ho, but on the others. You can also find red list summaries where we've pointed out concerns that we have with other prospects. We're not trying to be mean. We're not trying to go negative, but it's really important that we consider all the evidence that's out there. So we'll continue putting out these summaries on this platform, and we hope you'll come back and get educated and be ready for a Supreme Court vacancy. Thanks a lot.